In a world defined by power, influence, and the relentless pursuit of resources, Africa has always stood at the center of global attention. Beneath its soil lies untold wealth: gold, oil, diamonds, uranium, resources that fuel the engines of the modern world. For decades, foreign powers have drawn invisible lines across its lands, cutting deals, dictating terms, and deciding futures. Yet, a new generation of African leaders has begun to reject these old arrangements. One of the most symbolic moments of this awakening came when Burkina Faso's leader, Ibrahim Traoré, blocked what was described as the Trump administration's 60% takeover proposal of Africa's gold and oil operations, a move that shocked Washington and sent ripples through global markets. When the proposed agreement first emerged, it was framed as a strategic partnership between the United States and several African nations. Officially, it was meant to bring investment, technology, and stability to resource sectors long plagued by corruption and inefficiency. But beneath the diplomatic language lay a reality that many African economists and political analysts saw as another form of neo-colonial extraction. The deal would have given American corporations controlling stakes as high as 60% in gold mines, oil fields, and exploration zones across select African states. It was an attempt, critics said, to secure energy dominance in a rapidly changing global market. At the time, Africa's vast reserves had become a focus of renewed global competition. China had already established deep roots through infrastructure projects and loans. Russia had entered with military agreements and resource trade deals. The U.S., seeing its influence wane, sought to reassert control under the guise of mutual economic benefit. But Traoré, known for his blunt rhetoric and nationalist stance, refused to play the game by the old rules. He declared that Africa would no longer surrender its wealth for promises that never materialize. His government blocked the deal, closed negotiations, and ordered a review of all foreign contracts involving natural resources. This act did not go unnoticed. Western media framed it as a dangerous move, warning of economic isolation and instability. Yet across Africa, Traoré's decision was seen as a moment of defiance, a declaration that the continent would no longer be a silent partner in its own exploitation. Analysts across the continent described the move as the Economic Independence Manifesto, a turning point that could inspire other nations to reclaim control of their natural assets. The response from Washington was cautious but firm. Official statements spoke of disappointment and concern, but behind closed doors, pressure intensified. Reports emerged that diplomatic envoys attempted to convince Burkina Faso to reconsider. Promises of aid, investment, and security cooperation were offered in exchange for reopening the talks. But Traoré remained unmoved. His administration instead began strengthening alliances with neighboring states and non-Western powers. He spoke openly about forming an African resource bloc, a coalition that would manage the continent's gold and oil independently, setting fairer prices and reinvesting profits locally. For the first time in years, the narrative was shifting. Africa was no longer the passive subject of global deals. It was asserting itself as an equal player. The confrontation revealed deeper tensions that had long simmered beneath the surface. Since independence, many African economies have remained structurally dependent on exports of raw materials. While foreign investors profited, local populations often saw little improvement in living standards. Corruption, weak institutions, and unfair contracts perpetuated this imbalance. Traoré's rejection of the 60% takeover deal became a symbol of resistance against that system. It wasn't just about one agreement. It was about rewriting the rules of engagement between Africa and the world. Washington's concern was not limited to Burkina Faso. The fear was that Traoré's stance might inspire others. Already, nations like Mali and Niger had begun to expel Western military forces and review mining concessions. The idea of a self-reliant Africa, one controlling its own resources, challenged the very foundation of Western strategic planning. For decades, the continent's energy exports had been quietly integrated into the economic and security calculations of major powers. A disruption of that system would mean higher costs, reduced access, and a major geopolitical shift. Global markets reacted with unease. Speculation in gold and oil futures surged as investors anticipated disruptions in supply chains. Analysts debated whether Africa's growing independence could trigger a new kind of resource nationalism. Some argued it was long overdue, a necessary correction to decades of imbalance. Others warned that without Western oversight, mismanagement and instability could follow. The debate itself reflected a larger truth. The world had underestimated the political maturity rising within Africa's new generation of leaders. Traoré's actions resonated beyond economics. His speeches spoke of dignity, unity, and sovereignty. He framed resource control not as an act of defiance, but as a step toward genuine partnership, one based on equality rather than dependency. He emphasized that Africa was not against cooperation with the West, but against exploitation disguised as partnership. This nuanced position drew admiration even among Western observers, who saw in him a reflection of Africa's long struggle for self-determination. He became a symbol, young, assertive, unafraid, of a continent seeking its own destiny. In the months that followed, diplomatic relations became increasingly complex. The U.S. proposed alternative forms of cooperation, emphasizing democracy and human rights as conditions for future engagement. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso began to strengthen ties with other regional blocs and sought to develop its own refining and processing capacities. The government launched initiatives to train local engineers, geologists, and economists to manage national industries. These steps were modest but symbolic, representing a shift from dependence to capacity building. The international reaction was mixed. Some African governments quietly supported Traoré but hesitated to follow openly, fearing economic retaliation. Others began renegotiating existing deals with foreign companies, demanding fairer terms. Across the continent, the debate over sovereignty versus investment grew louder. Could Africa truly go its own way in a globalized economy? Could it resist the combined influence of the world's major powers? For many, Traoré's decision was proof that it was at least possible to try. By mid-year, intelligence reports suggested growing concern among Western policymakers. Analysts noted that if Burkina Faso's example spread, it could lead to a reconfiguration of global energy markets. A continent once viewed as a supplier of cheap resources could become a major price setter. For the U.S., this posed strategic challenges. The Trump administration's original deal was part of a broader policy to secure energy sources outside the Middle East, diversify supply chains, and counter China's Belt and Road Initiative. The collapse of the African deal meant losing a key pillar of that strategy. But beyond geopolitics, something deeper was happening. Across African universities and think tanks, scholars began re-examining economic models long dictated by the IMF and World Bank. Young economists proposed new frameworks emphasizing local ownership, transparency, and reinvestment. The idea of resource nationalism evolved into resource responsibility, a balanced approach seeking profit without dependency. Traoré's defiance became an intellectual movement, inspiring debate and policy shifts across the continent. As the months turned into a year, the U.S.-Africa relationship entered a new phase. Rather than confrontation, there was cautious recalibration. Washington began reaching out through regional organization, hoping to rebuild trust. Yet the era of one-sided deals seemed to be fading. Africa's leaders had realized the power of collective negotiation. They began coordinating through the African Union to establish common standards for foreign investment. The spirit of no more exploitation echoed in policy rooms from Addis Ababa to Accra. Behind closed doors, even Western corporations began reassessing their approach. Many realized that the old tactics of dominance were no longer sustainable. To secure access, they would have to adapt, offering genuine partnerships, technology transfers, and local employment. Some firms began aligning with African governments to develop value chains within the continent. Refineries, processing plants, and research centers began to appear where once only extraction sites existed. The continent was slowly transforming its role from supplier to producer. In Burkina Faso, Traoré's popularity soared. His government faced challenges: inflation, limited infrastructure, and external pressure. Yet the sense of pride among citizens grew stronger. For many, his defiance symbolized hope that Africa could stand on its own terms. Students marched with banners reading "Our gold, our oil, our future." Local media began producing documentaries celebrating the nation's struggle for economic independence. Across borders, similar movements emerged, calling for audits of foreign contracts and greater transparency in resource management. But the story did not end there. The U.S., unable to secure the original deal, began pursuing indirect strategies. Private firms, backed by lobbying groups, sought bilateral agreements with individual African states. The idea was to bypass unified resistance by exploiting divisions among governments. However, Africa's growing sense of unity made that strategy difficult. Regional cooperation strengthened as countries shared intelligence and legal expertise to protect their assets from unfair contracts. Meanwhile, China and Russia saw opportunities. They offered alternative frameworks with less political interference, though not without their own strategic motives. Traoré skillfully balanced these relations, ensuring that no single foreign power gained dominance. His diplomacy was grounded in pragmatism, open to all, controlled by none. That balance became his signature policy and a model for others navigating the complex web of global politics. As the global energy transition accelerated, Africa's resources gained new significance. Gold became a hedge against economic uncertainty, while oil remained vital, even in the age of renewables. Traoré's early resistance positioned his nation to negotiate from strength. When international companies returned with new proposals, they found a government no longer desperate for aid, but ready to demand fair terms. Transparency laws were enacted, royalties increased, and local participation became mandatory in every new contract. Economists began to note a shift in Africa's trade patterns. Instead of exporting raw minerals, countries started exporting refined products and finished goods. Though progress was uneven, the direction was clear. The legacy of Traoré's stand against the 60% takeover deal had set in motion a broader continental awakening, one that redefined Africa's place in the global order. The West, too, adapted. Realizing that coercion and dominance were counterproductive, new diplomatic channels emphasized respect, cooperation, and shared growth. The narrative changed from helping Africa to partnering with Africa. While skeptics doubted the sincerity of this shift, it represented a recognition of Africa's rising influence. In the end, the blocked deal became more than a political incident. It became a symbol of awakening, of assertion, of dignity. Traoré's decision to say no was not a rejection of the world, but an invitation to rebuild relations on equal terms. His defiance reminded the global community that partnership requires respect, and respect begins with sovereignty. When Africa said no, it did not close the door. It simply demanded a seat at the table. And as new generations of leaders rise across the continent, they carry forward that message, that Africa is not a market to be conquered, but a partner to be respected. The world, once accustomed to dictating, is now learning to listen. And in that quiet shift lies the beginning of a new global balance, one born not from the events that followed Traoré's decision continued to reshape how Africa interacted with global powers. In the months after the refusal, quiet but significant shifts began appearing in regional economies. Neighboring countries started reassessing their own partnerships with foreign corporations. In Ghana, Nigeria, and Sudan, new policies were drafted to ensure that at least half of all resource profits stayed within national borders. The rejection of the 60% takeover had given African governments something they hadn't had in decades: leverage. The old order, built on dependency and dictated contracts, was beginning to crumble under the weight of African unity. This realization sent shockwaves through international markets. Investors, long accustomed to cheap access to Africa's resources, began looking elsewhere. Gold prices surged as African nations withheld exports to renegotiate fairer contracts. Oil output from African fields slowed temporarily as governments reviewed foreign ownership agreements. Critics in the West called it an African bottleneck. But on the continent, it was celebrated as a long-overdue correction, a rare moment when Africa dictated the pace of global trade rather than merely reacting to it. In Burkina Faso, the people began seeing tangible effects of this shift. The government initiated national resource programs focused on developing small-scale local industries. Instead of exporting crude oil, the country invested in small refining plants. Instead of sending raw gold abroad, new partnerships were formed to process it domestically. Local universities introduced specialized programs in geology, engineering, and economics to create a skilled generation capable of managing their nation's wealth. Slowly, the idea of self-sufficiency stopped being a dream and started becoming a national goal. But the transformation was not without challenges. Western powers began to apply pressure through diplomatic isolation and economic restrictions. Aid packages were delayed. Loans from international banks became harder to access. Media coverage turned critical, portraying Traoré as an authoritarian figure endangering his nation's economy. Yet, inside Africa, a different narrative was emerging. He was seen as a reformer, a leader willing to sacrifice short-term comfort for long-term independence. In the streets, murals appeared depicting Traoré alongside other African icons who had resisted foreign domination. His name began to symbolize a broader movement for dignity and economic freedom. The ideological impact was massive. Across universities and public discussions, Africans began to talk about the Traoré doctrine. It was simple, but powerful. No contract that compromises sovereignty, no deal that benefits outsiders more than the people, and no partnership without transparency. These three principles became the moral foundation of a new political movement across the continent. Even leaders who disagreed with Traoré's methods admitted that his message resonated deeply with a population tired of exploitation disguised as assistance.